In a previous video, I addressed the question, should vegans eat organic food? And this was in response to seeing a lot of articles in newspapers, magazines, online that were saying, there's really no difference between organically grown and conventionally grown food. There's no real health or environmental or any other benefits to eating organically grown food. And I was also seeing this in the vegan YouTube community, people saying, yeah, so it's no different. And then plus, organically grown food has animal inputs like manure. And so they were saying, vegans shouldn't eat organically grown food because it removes the waste disposal cost from animal agriculture. So, in some ways, it financially supports that industry. In that last video, I addressed this question kind of in general, and today I want to talk more specifically. This will probably be a series of videos, but what I will do today is actually show the difference between conventional, organic, and veganic farming techniques by showcasing three different farmers. The first farmer is a young man who is farming alongside his father. He is a multi-generational farmer in Minnesota, and they are conventionally growing corn and soybeans in rotation. And these are genetically modified crops, which is it's pretty typical of what's done in the United States. The second farmer, he's also a multi-generational farmer, but he's from Kansas, and he was certified organic all the way back in 1989. And he's doing a crop rotation including corn, soy, wheat, and some other crops along with cattle. And then the last farmer is from Canada, and he's growing wheat without any animal inputs. And he is marketing this product to 1 Degree Organic Foods, which is a company that showcases its veganic farmers. So the first two farmers have their own YouTube channels, and I've included them because they have really detailed information about their farming practices. I subscribe to both of their channels, and I would encourage you to go take a look at their full videos because I'm just taking clips here just to make a really concise video and provide an overview. So in the video description below, I'll leave a link to their channels and also to the 1 Degree Organic Foods website. Something that seems to get repeated is that organic farmers are always plowing and tearing up their soil, whereas conventional farmers don't work their soil, they do no-till, and so it's better for soil health and the environment.
We just need to open the ground up and pull some of the black to the top, bury some of the trash to get this stuff to heat up in the spring so we can work it. We till all of our soils up here because we're so far north, we get a lot of cold, wet springs. And the big concern for us is if the soil doesn't dry out in the spring, it can be really hard to get in and get that planted. We'll come in with a field cultivator or a digger, we call it. So we'll dig this about 3 to 4 inches deep. We really don't see a point to digging it too deep. We just want to scratch that top, level it off, and make a nice seed bed. So that's step number one to what we do to get the fields ready.
As I talk about these different farming techniques, I'm going to mostly be using data from this USDA report from 2019. So farmers can use management practices such as no-till and cover crops to build soil health. And according to the 2012 census, 35% of acres were in no-till, and only 3% had cover crops. And when we're talking about conventional no-till, for the most part, this is use of an herbicide to kind of kill off the vegetation and then create a clean seed bed in which to plant. And it's kind of interesting that despite more use of tillage in organic farming, they're going to do weed cultivation along with their primary tillage. It says here that long-term cropping system experiments have found that organic cropping systems can sequester as much soil organic carbon, for example, as no-till conventional systems.
I just wanted to show you a little bit of using the disc for the primary tillage. We're in a corn residue field. We're actually going pretty shallow, about 3.5 inches. But it's working up smooth enough that I will be able to come in now with that aggressive field cultivator I showed you last spring, and with one pass, have a seed bed.
They floated on urea, which is a commercial fertilizer that we use for nitrogen. We put our phosphorus and our potassium and a couple of other micronutrients down last fall. So he's just tilling the soil down about 3, 4, 5 inches deep. If we leave that urea sit on the top of the soil, what happens is the nitrogen will start to go into the air. Basically, we lose it.
Commercial fertilizer is manufactured using petroleum products, and its use surged after 1960 and kind of leveled off in the early 80s. So, conventional farmers using synthetic fertilizer have to be more concerned about the immediate timing of nitrogen application because they're essentially feeding the plants, whereas the theory in organic farming is that you're building up nutrients in the soil and it's sequestered in the soil to be available to plants. And because organic farmers aren't allowed to use synthetic fertilizers, they rely more on things like legume cover crops, which fix nitrogen into the soil, and also manure and compost to add nutrients to the soil.
Looking up here in front of us, this is a green manure cover crop. We're on one of our poor clay hill fields. We are working it down. We will let it sit for the next month. In that time period, I will spread manure. I will also spread hill lime on this field. So this year we have done soil building and we've done cattle grazing. Next year we have the wheat. The year after we will leave the clover and we will hopefully make clover seed on it.
It's a good time for us to spray these beans. They're big enough to handle the spray. They're growing fast. When we came through this spring and sprayed this with pre-emerge right after the beans were planted, and this is the spot where the sprayer, the booms probably didn't turn on in time. This is the water hemp. This is our most dominant weed right now. This is the one we're having a lot of problems with. It's become pretty resistant to glyphosate or Roundup. It'll really help if we can get dicamba resistant or 2,4-D resistant beans. If we could come through here with a different chemistry, we could really knock these water hemp out. Next thing we're putting in is Roundup or glyphosate. We have Roundup resistant or glyphosate resistant beans that we plant. But to take care of the giant ragweed and the water hemp, what we're spraying here is it's called Chafin. Next thing we put in is Secure. It's a generic fusilade, and what we're putting that in the mix for is to kill off our volunteer corn. You can see the chemical coming out, and again, most of it is water, but you can see a little bit of that mist.
This would be the most common way that a conventional farmer would handle weeds in these major crops. Genetically engineered crops were introduced in 1996, and by now about 90% of acres of domestic corn, cotton, soybeans, and sugar beets, and canola use GE seeds. And it's important to remember that GE seeds are not allowed for certified organic crops. And as of 2015, only 0.3% of U.S. corn and soybeans were grown organically. And so that leaves a small portion of conventional farmers who are growing without genetically engineered seeds. So these farmers will still use an herbicide to control weeds, but they can't spray their soybeans directly as we were seeing in the previous clips. And the soy-based products from these crops are what you might see in the supermarket that could be labeled non-GMO project verified. And I think that a lot of people get confused and think that this non-GMO label means that the product was grown organically, but that's not the case unless you see the certified organic label. And as you see from the previous clips, this farmer is dealing with something that's come up more recently in that they're having to add additional herbicides along with the glyphosate because there are now glyphosate resistant weeds. And you might be wondering, why have we been talking about crops like corn and soy? And that's because these are the two single largest cash crops grown in the United States. As far as millions of acres planted, the largest crops are actually corn, soybeans, wheat, and hay. So when we look at millions of pounds of pesticides applied each year, this graph is for corn, cotton, fall, potatoes, soybeans, and wheat. And as you can see, the amount of herbicide application is huge compared to the use of insecticides, fungicides, and other pesticides.
What's going on in the field here? I'm coming back for the second cultivation of soybeans. On that first cultivation, we pushed dirt in on the soybeans, but there were some weeds that we missed. We did not push enough dirt. Step over here where I've already gone. And so we have reversed the ridges. Now the field is actually ridged up on the crop, and if you pull that crop back, we have pushed the dirt up. We've covered those first two leaves, and we have cleaned next to the row. When you're in the tractor, you vary your speed, and you hug the row, and you clean the row. So let's run in the tractor just a little bit.
But weed cultivation doesn't always go that smoothly in an unusually wet season as we see here.
We had that 60-100 rainfall event, and so now I've got a nice flush of weeds out here. And surprise, surprise, the weather forecaster tonight is calling for a big rainfall event. And I don't want to let this foxtail get started. So the problem that we have is that the beans are awful, awful small. I have never cultivated beans this little before. And cultivating beans like this, I can barely see the rows in the mirror behind me. Cultivating beans like this is not for the faint of heart. You better have your cultivator right and tight and set uniformly. You better know where your tractor drives. There's just no margin for error.
So I am out here scouting for soybean aphids, and I'm not finding a whole lot yet, but I am finding some. This is one of our worst fields. We try to get away with not spraying them, but I don't know that I really remember a year that we haven't had to. Today we're spraying soybean aphids. You can see Dad out there. We wish we didn't have to spray it. Unfortunately, we have to, or these aphids will destroy our crop. And what we're going to do with it, this is not something you'd spray this late in the year. What I'm going to do with it is put it in a hand sprayer and go around to some of the spots, just the small spots in the end rows where we're getting breakouts of water hemp or ragweed. And you look at this one jug and you think about the fact that this cost us $500. Trust me, we're not interested in drenching the fields in pesticides.
So, whereas insecticides can be used as the first line of defense by conventional farmers to control pests, organic farmers are required to use other methods, such as crop rotation and promoting ecological balance, in order to control pests. But if all of these methods have failed, organic farmers are allowed to use some natural and a few approved synthetic insecticides in order to control the situation. But that's provided that the conditions for using the substance are documented in the organic system plan, as I talked about in my last video. In looking through the Geiger farm videos, I didn't see him spraying anything to control pests. So then I looked down in the comment section of this one video, and somebody asked a question that I was thinking too. He said, "Hey, what are you going to do about the Japanese beetles?" And Geiger farm answered, "I don't do anything other than allow nature to take its course. From my perspective, they have helped me in that they ate the hemp dog bane, velvet leaf, and water hemp more than the soybeans. I have not used an insecticide ever on the field crops."
When we walked this field, we saw a bunch of Japanese beetle that were eating on velvet leaf, and there's some hemp dog bane out here, but that Japanese beetle was eating on the hemp dog bane.
Looks like there was a hatch of ground wasps here. And there must be, several hundred of them here flying around. We're in one of our pastures, and we have a sourdock. And I don't know what this bug is. I probably need to identify him, but he is just eating that sourdock. He's about completely defoliated it. I don't know what that little guy is, but he is a fast traveler, and apparently he likes sourdocks. So apparently he's my friend.
We've got dicamba beans here, which is new for us. They've been around for 2 or 3 years, but you haven't actually been able to spray dicamba on them until, I believe it's this year. Dicamba, if sprayed under the wrong conditions, it can actually lift up off of the leaves of the plant and kind of float around, and it can float over to the neighbor's field and sit down on their beans. So today I'm going to go over and look at the neighbor's field because he's pretty sure he's got some dicamba damage there. So we want to document that and watch that in case he's got a yield loss. This is pretty obviously dicamba damage, the way these leaves are cupped. It does go all the way up this fence line. The fields come apart around the corner there, everything's good, but then there's another 1,000 feet along there where it's damaged just like this.
Here he's talking about his neighbor's field where they're growing conventionally, but they don't have those dicamba resistant soybeans, and he'll be tracking to see if they need to compensate for any yield loss. Now, if the neighbor were growing organically, then the situation could be pretty devastating.
It's Saturday, July 6th, and we're going to make a video that no organic farmer should have to make. The damage goes throughout the entire bottom here. Okay, so I suspect that we have been subject to chemical drift, and I suspect that the agent is dicamba.
In Geiger Farm's latest video, he explains in the video description what some of the outcomes were from this dicamba drift. He ended up having to sell the soybeans for a lower price because they couldn't be certified organic. And he does note at the end here that he lost organic certification on those drifted fields for 3 years. And so those fields will have to be farmed separately from his other fields for that duration. So, when comparing the conventional and organic farming techniques, I didn't go into things like planting and harvesting because a lot of that stuff is pretty much the same. So, I just wanted to highlight the differences and actually the important similarities as well. As far as veganic farming, it's harder to find information on these farmers, probably kind of like looking for information on organic farmers back in the 80s and 90s. But there is a company called 1 Degree Organic Foods, which has its veganic products in grocery stores like Whole Foods. And I'll show some clips of one of their farmers in Canada who grows wheat. And we're not going to see the level of detail about farming techniques as with the other two farmers, but I'll leave a link in the video description below so that you can see the whole video and the profiles of all the other farmers who sell their products to that company.
I didn't know too much if I could come out as well financially as I would conventional. I raise just as much as the conventional farmer does. These herbicides and insecticides cost a lot of money, and the fertilizer costs a lot of money. And by growing fall rye and spring wheat together, then you have a combination where the ground is green most of the time. And when the land is laying like that, then the bacteria and the enzymes do their work to really build up the soil.
That's a real brief comparison between conventional, organic, and veganic farming of three major crops. So, where do we get this idea that there's no difference in growing organically? Well, one example would be the articles that I threw up at the beginning of this video. All of these opinion pieces were written by a fellow named Henry Miller, and a few years back he published an article as his own, which had actually been drafted by Monsanto. So it's conflicts of interest like this that can make things kind of unclear. And the confusing thing is that oftentimes these arguments actually do have a kernel of truth. So I'd like to talk in more detail about a few of these topics in future videos. But as far as this idea that it's not vegan to eat organic food because of the manure, the bottom line is that organic farming does not require manure, as I've shown here. And actually, I've been doing quite a bit of research about manure recently, and we'll probably do a video about that next at some point in the future. But here's something to think about. So you know corn is sold to feed livestock, and also for ethanol fuel and for food products. So I could just as easily say that it's not vegan to eat non-organic tortilla chips, for example, because you are supporting a conventional farmer who sells his corn at a lower price, thereby lowering input costs for the animal agriculture industry. I mean, these ideas seem like such a stretch to me, and I just don't think that we should be making decisions like this with regards to something as important as the future of farming.